Gary, while we're waiting, why don't we ask Ian MacMillan to introduce himself?
Sure. Ian,
yes, hi, Mark.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you could hear me, but
We can.
my father was the organizer of the journey that Mark is going to be making the presentation on. So I guess I was one of the youngest members of the canoe trip. I was 14 at the time.
Okay. Wow.
So
yeah, this is one thing I'm trying to do now is like, you know how we've got Nastawgan and it's printed. We actually have like an e-Nastawgan we're trying to develop in parallel where, we contact the author. So when the author submits a story, it's usually a month or so before we go to print and we, edit it down and whatever we do to it and put it in our print thing. But simultaneously, the e-Nastawgan people are looking at it. And, I asked them to contact authors to say, okay, get more pictures, more movies. So the e-Nastawgan would be everything the print is, minus the paper, plus movies. You can ask the author questions, yada, yada, yada. This is like another offshoot saying, okay, everybody just got, the printed article in the journal, like by mail the last couple of days. And they've read it maybe. And now, we bring this different aspect in line here to say, okay, here's the author. He's going to give an overview. So he's not going to regurgitate the presentation or the print version, but, maybe have more insight, and there's a Q&A associated with it. And Mark is, going to be the first guinea pig here to see if this works. So it's good to have people in the audience. So I think we'll start. So I've got a bio here from Mark, and I'll introduce him. Sorry, I've got two screens here, so I'm looking at two different screens simultaneously. So if I'm not looking at the right camera angle. All right, so Mark's bio. So Mark Stiles is the author of the paper that just came out in the Nastawgan 2022 spring issue. And Mark resides in Ottawa, where he is mostly retired after 40 years of work in developing countries with Indigenous organizations in Canada's northern regions. Like many of us, he is a canoe head, a longtime member of the WCA, currently a member of the governance and nominating committee of the Canadian Canoe Museum, and a former member of the Ontario's canoe team in 1971 BC Centennial celebrations. A privileged paddler on some of Canada's most remote river systems, an active environmentalist, and a good friend of the late Hugh MacMillan and Shaman Chief Kippu. So Mark, it's all yours.
Great. Okay, thank you, Gary, for this introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak to some of the WCA members about this rather extraordinary and historic canoe trip. Let me begin by just acknowledging that I'm presenting from the comfort of my home here in Ottawa, and that is on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'm going to make this land acknowledgement out of respect for the Indigenous peoples of this country, but also our indebtedness to them for designing the marvelous crafts that we use to explore the lakes and rivers of this country. So my plan is to present to you first some background on the brigade, show you a bit of the planned route and introduce you to some of the key players who were on that trip. Following that, I'll read a couple of short excerpts from the article, and that will leave ample time for some questions. And if there's time at the end, I could show a clip from the movie that was made about the brigade as well. How does that sound? Good. Okay, then Gary, if you could turn it over to me, and I'll I'll pull up my slide presentation. Okay, so the purpose of the trip was to retrace the fur trade route from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg as part of Manitoba's Centennial celebrations and to mark the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company. Most of us on the trip were dressed in voyageur garb because we're being filmed for a movie. There were 35 paddlers. The youngest was 13 years of age. The oldest was 68. Hugh McMillan at the time was 46, and I was tender age of 21. We had 35 paddle. We had 5 26-foot north canoes, about 6 or 7 paddlers per canoe. 2 17-foot canoes, one for the film crew, the other for 2 women who wisely kept ahead of our main party. The planned distance was about 415 miles. That's 668 kilometers over 20 days. But we pulled out at Crane Lake, Minnesota, which is right up about here, a distance of about 250 miles or 400 or so kilometers. Yeah, this map shows the route we took, which was the lower route here from the Pigeon River up through the Rainy Lake area. And after 1803, this northern route became the accepted or the most popular route for Canadian fur traders because the Americans started to impose a tariff on the lower route here. That's according to Eric Morse's 1968 Fur Trade Routes of Canada, then and now. So another shot of the route follows the green line here, right up as far as Lac La Croix. The distance from Grand Portage down here at the start off Lake Superior to Crane Lake, where we stopped, was and went on by car and trailer, was about 200 miles or 322 kilometers. And that took about 10 days. We were averaging 20 miles a day. It's about 32 kilometers a day. Along that route, there were 29 portages for a total of 15 miles of portaging. Those portages, some of them were quite brutal. So I'll say a few things about the organizer of the trip, Hugh McMillan. Just for background, Hugh P. McMillan was a descendant of James McMillan, a partner in the Northwest Company in the early 1800s and an assistant to David Thompson. James McMillan took part in some of the earliest surveys of the lower Fraser River area, and he founded Fort Langley in British Columbia. Hugh was extremely proud of his ancestry and became so steeped in fur trade history that his wife Muriel often said that he should have been born 200 years earlier. He was on the board of Kirk Whipper's Kanawha International Collection of Canoes, Kayaks, and Rowing Craft, and he assisted Kirk in locating numerous canoes for that collection. He was a key figure in the establishment of the Northwestern Loyalist Museum in Williamstown, Ontario, and anybody who hasn't seen that little museum and is interested in fur trade and whatnot should go and have a look. It's quite a marvelous little museum. In 1970, at the time of the brigade, Hugh was amid an illustrious career with the Archives of Ontario as a roving archivist. He was responsible for tracking down and purchasing valuable papers, artifacts, and memorabilia related to Ontario's history. And as anyone who knew Hugh knows, he was doggedly persistent in this pursuit, earning the title of the Indiana Jones of document hunters. So Hugh traveled the Ontario quite incessantly between 1994 and 1998. And was often seen wearing a kilt and a tam o' shanter. He was frequently mistaken for Farley Mowat, something he rather enjoyed, I think. So he would be often seen carrying a black leather binder full of notes and telephone numbers, and he never seemed to pass a telephone booth without making a call to one of his contacts, no matter what time of day or night, I'll add. Throughout his career, he acquired quite a treasure trove of materials for the archives, and I'll just mention a few. He found the papers of Sir John Graves Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. He discovered the bugle from Canada's first warship, the Rainbow. He and David Anderson located and purchased the Alexander Mackenzie's brass compass case, which they found in New Zealand. He uncovered the genealogical records of settlers in the Ottawa Valley containing more than 2 million names. And he got these from a Catholic priest named Father Gravel, who was the son of a mathematician. He was also a chess whiz and a master safecracker. Hugh discovered a large cache of 19th century quarter sessions records in the attic of the Brockville courthouse. But these were under 2 feet of pigeon shit. But this important find resulted in a 3 or 4 year battle that you had with the bean counters in the Ontario government to justify the purchase of a $10 shovel from Canadian Tire, which he had used to extricate these valuable documents from under the pigeon poop. So Hugh knew every eccentric in the province of Ontario and beyond, including many unusual collectors such as David Brown, who kept more than 100,000 books in his small country home, and Bill Gregg, who had on his farm an extensive collection of World War II Canadian military vehicles, including tanks. So quite a colorful character, and it's no wonder he had some colorful characters on this canoe trip. Before he died in 2012 at the age of 88, Hugh authored a memoir, and here it is, Adventures of a Paper Sleuth. It was published by Penumbra Press in 2004. Hugh and his wife Muriel raised 4 children in Willowdale, Ontario, and later in a log house that quite a few of us were involved in the construction of up in Rockwood near Guelph, Ontario. So I'll talk a little bit about the next person on the trip, a colorful character on the trip. This is Shaman Chief Kitpoo, otherwise named James Munster. And what I have to say about Kitpoo is gleaned from the time I spent with him in the years following the Canoe Brigade, and and a draft biography, which was written by the late James Glenhill. And excerpts from that biography can be found on the Facebook link in the digital version of my article on the WCA website. Okay, Kitpu was orphaned at birth in Ontario and adopted by a wealthy German textile family with the surname Munster in Sherbrooke, Quebec. And he was given the name James Munster, as we see there. He attended Bishop College School in Lennox, a rather prestigious school, where he excelled in sports, but he never really fitted in socially. He joined the Navy in 1942, and during World War II combat, he sustained a fairly serious head injury, and that was likely on the Murmansk run in the North Atlantic. His injury and the trauma of war resulted in what today would likely be diagnosed as PTSD. He was given a medical discharge in 1944. In 1946, he married Ruby Isabel Stewart, the only surviving child of a fundamentalist preacher who and his wife, who were on the near Bear River, Nova Scotia. And at the time, Ruby had been abandoned by her husband and was left with 3 children. So they settled in rural Nova Scotia, but James's mental health issues persisted for quite some time. They spent long periods of time on the Micmac Reserve near Bear River, Nova Scotia, where the Micmac bestowed upon him the name Wobe Kitpu. And gradually, Kitpu took on this persona as a way of healing from the traumas of the war and a rather troubled youth. From my knowledge, he was accepted by the Micmac for the most part and praised for his efforts to learn their culture, secure government grants, and advocate for their well-being, which he did with some vigor. By the 1960s, he had become somewhat of a media celebrity, having met with Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, provincial premiers, federal officials responsible for Indian affairs, and he corresponded with Queen Elizabeth and many other prominent figures. In 1967, with the help of a small Centennial grant, Kitpu and his family converted a retired TTC bus into a traveling Indian museum, which they named the Rolling Reserve. Here's a photo of that. They set off from Bear River, Nova Scotia during that centennial year with a full tank of gas, $20 from the sale of Ruby's washing machine, and 3 days of food. Well, they kept it going for most of the year. They traveled the country, entertaining whoever would gather to listen to their stories. Mayor Drapeau of Montreal hosted them at Expo 67, and the head of General Motors installed a new motor in their bus when the Rolling Reserve broke down near Toronto. They eventually settled around Lytton, British Columbia. And between 1967 and his death in 1988, Kitpu gained international notoriety. And I'll give you a few examples. He presented a peace pipe to Prime Minister Trudeau in 1968. He visited Japan in 1976 on behalf of a consortium of companies in Banff. He later participated in a VIP tour of Hawaii, and he made several trips to Europe. He did promotional work for Imperial Tobacco at trade shows. He had numerous television appearances in Canada and the US. And he became a close friend of Kirk Whipper at Camp Candelore, and that's probably where he caught Hugh MacMillan's attention. And he helped transport Victor Adams' Haida canoe from Prince Rupert to Toronto, that beautiful dugout canoe that's now featured in the Canadian Canoe Museum's collection in Peterborough. He attended powwows, scout jamborees, summer festivals, and he spoke to thousands of children in schools and always was able to get a large crowd. Became a skilled totem carver, and he carved totems, some of them 50 to 60 feet tall. Those totems could be found in places such as Sudbury, Wawa, Sioux Narrows, Jasper, Banff, and there's even a totem pole that he carved in Stanley Park in Vancouver. Kitpu traveled extensively in the US, building custom totem poles for the likes of Tom Watson, the former CEO of IBM, Malcolm Forbes, the publisher of Time Life Corporation. Several of his carvings can be found in the Museum of Native American Culture in Spokane, Washington. He authored the Tribal Laws of the Children of Light, a collection of 190 aphorisms based on the learnings he and his wife Ruby had gleaned from First Nations knowledge keepers over the years. So those are a couple of the colorful characters, but there were others. There was a whole contingent of campers from Camp Candelore and a counselor or two. There were hitchhikers from that had been picked up along the way from journey from Toronto up to Thunder Bay. And of course, there were a couple of filmmakers. Here's a photo of one of them, Glenn Follis, who is with he and Greg Cowan, the other filmmaker from the Voyageur Canoe Company in Millbrook, Ontario. And of course, not to be forgotten, we had a mascot on this trip we named Cabot, a Manx cat, who eventually jumped ship, or a better way to put it, jumped canoe in Crane Lake, Minnesota, never to be seen again. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the article and show a few more slides while I do that. I'll begin with a quote from Hugh MacMillan's Nor'Wester Brigade newsletter, June 15th, 1970. That was about a month before the trip got underway. It reads, and I quote, "The trip will be filmed in some manner, and it is likely that the three-man professional film crew will accompany us in their 16-foot canoe with motor, so they can proceed ahead and keep from slowing us down." That's rather ironic, I think. "We want to have time to view the spectacular historic country we will be proceeding through, also to get in some fishing and swimming," which we rarely did. "We expect to supplement our diet with fish and also a variety of wild foods. We've got good advice in this area from a wilderness survival expert, Bert Bergeland, who unfortunately can't come as he is getting married. You can look forward to some interesting menu." Yes, it was interesting. "I will have some reading along to tell us what it used to be like over this route, and we will experience at first hand sweating it out over the portages. We want everyone to have a good time, particularly at the height of land ceremony, where a small dram of high wines will be issued to ease the pain." End of quote. And now from the article, this describes the packing up for the trip. in just north of Toronto and Willowdale. Wynne Jones, university friend, and I arrived at Hugh and Muriel MacMillan's residence on July 10th, a hot, sultry afternoon, 2 days before the scheduled departure. We were there to help with packing. Hugh wasn't there. He was late leaving Port Hope, where he'd been visiting Angus Mowat, Farley's father. So Wynne and I headed to the small basement room where we launched into sorting more than 1,500 sackets of chicken noodle soup, 100 packages of macaroni, and over 100 pounds of oatmeal, and 250 cans of meatballs. I discovered 40 boxes of barley balls, which according to the directions required 3 hours of soaking before cooking. Perhaps not the best of choice with the tight schedule and over 400 miles of hard paddling and portaging ahead of us. Late that evening, tired and sweaty from packing, Wynne went upstairs to use the shower and quickly returned laughing. I asked him, what's so funny? And without a word, he led me to the source of his amusement. There in the MacMillan's bathtub, floating in steaming murky water, was a 5-gallon hickory keg for Hugh's high wines, he said, sealing the cracks. And there it is. I had been forewarned about the near lethal potency of MacMillan's high wines and would soon learn that the stories were true. The next day, in ritualistic fashion, Hugh filled the keg with whatever alcohol brigade members had brought along, the heels of several bottles of liquor, 4 bottles of cheap rum, twice that of alcohol, overproof alcohol product, several bottles of strawberry brandy, multiple bottles of sacramental wine, and for good measure, a few dollops of unpasteurized honey and enough tincture of capsicum to choke an ox. And you can see here in the middle of this photo that the infamous keg being portaged by one of our crew members. Now, towards the end of the first day of paddling, so this is the first day out on the Pigeon River, and I read from the article, not all was well in our 26-foot North Canoe after leaving Grand Portage on our way west through the Ontario-Minnesota boundary waters, known as the Voyageur Highway. One paddler, a hitchhiker Hugh had picked up on the drive to Thunder Bay, developed a bad back. And after the first few miles, this back was aching, and he took a break to do some fishing. This annoyed our petulant bowsman, John Gadsby. No sooner had the fishing line dropped over the side, it became entangled in weeds. This annoyed Gadsby even more. We waded our heavily laden canoe up a 4-mile stretch of the Pigeon River. The cold, powerful current numbing our legs and the slippery rocks made the going treacherous. We were averaging less than a half a mile per hour when Kitpoo, medicine man of questionable authenticity, one of the characters that Hugh had recruited for the brigade, lodged his leg between a sharp rock and the full weight of the North Canoe. It took the combined effort of everyone to get Kitpoo calmed down. It was difficult to determine the extent of his injury, but it was obvious that he wouldn't be able to carry much across many of the portages that lay ahead. First day out, 2 men down. Tempers reached the boiling point beneath the weight of Hugh's 250-pound North Canoe. I think it weighed more than that, actually. Patched profusely with fiberglass as we neared the end of the long portage from Foul Lake into Foul Lake. It was then we heard a strange commotion, like some creature unhinged. I could feel the adrenaline racing as we set the canoe down quickly. We looked ahead in disbelief. there was Kitpoo, stark naked, save for the elk-horned headdress and a bandage on his right leg. With his arms outstretched, his head thrown back, he intoned in a high-pitched howl that sounded out of this world, wild-eyed and in a state of complete abandonment, his stocky body gleaming with sweat. As we watched this spectacle unfold, we could see that Kitpoo, who normally never touched alcohol, had siphoned a mug from Hugh's 5-gallon keg of high wines for medicinal purposes. Slowly, like an apparition, he hobbled out onto a cedar log at the water's edge. He paused for a moment, now with a mischievous grin, then plunged into the lake, broke into a powerful front crawl, and disappeared around the next point. This was a performance he would repeat several times in the days ahead with equal dramatic effect. And of course, it did quite a bit to slow down our party. Several days later, I'll read from the article. By mid-afternoon, we reached the 2-mile portage into Rove Lake, or from Rove Lake into Rose Lake, rated as the worst portage of the journey, next to the Grand Portage. The first 3/4 mile of sporadic trail twisted its way through a mosquito-infested swamp. Large cedar and spruce trees formed a tangled maze across the path, and the heavy rain made the exposed tree roots treacherous underfoot. Mud oozed up almost to our armpits in the deepest bog holes, forcing us to abandon our heavy loads until we could successfully extricate ourselves. That Morris Perkins, the captain of the Illinois canoe, carried little more than his paddle and a camera, leaving his vassals to carry his heavy gear, did little for our morale. Some, like me, traversed that miserable portage 6 times. As the light began to fade, we had all the gear and one of the canoes across. We used that canoe to ferry everyone to the nearby campsite, the last of the voyageurs arriving at 9 p.m. 2 American fishermen already camped at the site, but they were more than a little taken aback by our bedraggled gang, some in breechclouts, others in mud-spattered period costumes. At first, they were apprehensive about sharing their campsite, but Hugh's fast talking and a dram of high wines changed their minds. They set up a large fire and cooked us up a huge pot of spaghetti. And that was enjoyed by everyone and allowed us to get our camp set up with a belly full of warm food. However, an increasingly irascible Gadsby refused to pitch his tent and bunked in with the Americans. Now, Gadsby, for whatever reasons, wouldn't set up his tent if we landed at a campsite anytime after around 5 o'clock in the late afternoon. But there we are. So we reached the height of land late the following day in a downpour, but no film crew, much to Kitpoo's dismay. Hugh's journal reads, and I quote, "We looked for a campsite which took until 10:30 p.m. Plenty of trouble getting a fire going, but we finally got something to eat by 11:30 and stretched out our tarps over the canoes and rocks. A liberal tot of high wines managed to take the chill from the evening, and we finally got to bed at 1 a.m. End of quote." Gadsby was not amused. So the next day we dried everything out by noon. Our campsite was bedlam with all manner of clothing and gear strewn over the rocks and tree branches. Hugh's journal reads, and I quote, "We put everyone through the height of land ceremony, where they promised never to let anyone pass this point without a similar ceremony, not to kiss the voyageur's wife without her permission. And then each one got his tot of high wines." Kitpoo was a great big help and very impressive in handling this part of the ceremony in his full regalia. And there he is. "I presented each man with a beaver token as a symbol of his having crossed over the height of land. The crews have the right to feel pleased, as this has been a tough session thus far, and one that few men or boys will ever get the opportunity of participating in." End of quote. Now to the Manitoba Centennial celebrations in the Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg. My article reads, on Sunday, August 2nd, the Manitoba Centennial Corporation arranged a church service for us, which the service was conducted in Latin and French, as was the tradition at the height of the fur trade. Unfortunately, a rock concert in the park across from the Manitoba legislature proved a stronger draw for many of our voyageurs. Hugh and a few others returned to Lower Fort Garry that evening to meet Ed Schreier and the premiers of several other provinces. The camaraderie we had experienced along the Voyageur Highway was beginning to wane, overpowered by the inevitable distractions of civilization. Hugh MacMillan's 1970 Nor'Wester Brigade was drawing to a close. Some of us wanted nothing more than to push off again and head further into the backcountry to the rhythm of our paddles. But we had gained a first-hand look at the iconic Canadian Shield Country most of us hadn't seen before, and we had lived a part of this country's fur trade history. Despite the many mishaps, the discomforts, the occasional outbursts, one could not ask for a more memorable trip. One that broke all boundaries and crossed into the realm of the imagination. It was the stuff of dreams. The world could use more dreamers like Hugh P. MacMillan. Muriel, his wife, had been right. Hugh should have been born a couple of 100 years earlier, but for those who paddled with him in the great Canoe du Nord, we were grateful that he wasn't. And that ends the presentation. And I'll take happy to take questions.
People can turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. They can jump in.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on portaging the Voyageur canoes? It sounded like that was an absolute nightmare, but how many people would carry them? And did you eventually obviously got through them all?
Sure, good question, Tom. Yes, we did. They were, I think the Illinois canoe, the canoe from the small group from Illinois, was heaviest. It was well over 300 pounds, and most of the time we were using probably six people to portage one of those 26-foot canoes. Traditionally, the voyageurs did it with 4, and you know, we were 6, sometimes more, but we weren't used to doing that kind of portaging. I guess it's very awkward because sometimes you'd have the full weight of the canoe on your shoulder and very little weight at the other end on someone else's shoulder as you go up and down through the mud and rough portages that we saw.
I have a question, Mark. You said you made it to Crane Lake, and then you did the rest of the journey to Winnipeg by road. That was a time factor. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. We didn't do it all by road, but we did the bulk of it by road. We were already way behind schedule. The schedule we had been calculated on the basis of the 1967 canoe pageant from the canoe race from Rocky Mountain House to Montreal, and I think your dad Hugh just took that account and thought we could do the same, but he may had forgotten that the 67 pageant was supported by the Army, and the canoe groups from each province and territory in their 26-foot canoes had very little baggage to carry because it was transported by the military, and they were all big, strong men, as you can well imagine. We really struggled. Some of the people in our group had really done very little canoeing at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you put back in. Did you put back in Lake Winnipeg, or to come down to Winnipeg?
Well, we did some paddling on Lake Winnipeg and managed to tip the canoes in the high wind, and that got on some. That was filmed, and but I think we, if I recall correctly, we didn't have to paddle all the way down to Lower Fort Garry. We transported the canoes down there so that we could participate in the on time in the Centennial celebrations. Yeah.
How did the actual members get selected?
Well, they were mostly people that you knew, and you know, as I mentioned, quite a few were campers from Camp Candelore, and a counselor from there. You know, a lot of people, a number of people dropped out a week or so before the trip was to start. So we picked up hitchhikers, and so there were a couple of hitchhikers that rounded out the numbers in the canoes. But generally, they were friends and acquaintances of Hugh MacMillan.
Right. And you were 21, so you were quite a senior, I guess, camp, you know, follower, I guess, eh?
Yes, I got recruited because Hugh MacMillan knew my parents, and he turned up at our home near Cornwall once when I was down visiting, and quickly recruited me because I let it be known that I actually had done a little bit of paddling, and so therefore I was recruited on the spot.
Right. And can you say something about the food? You mentioned some of the cans and stuff like that, and what worked, what didn't work?
Well, to be truthful, not much of it worked very well. We did not eat all that well, certainly compared to the kind of foods we have on trips these days. The food was most of it was donated, and you know, some of it worked all right. The meatballs and whatnot were certainly welcomed. We got pretty tired of the of the chicken noodle soup, I think it was, and uh, there wasn't. Well, the other part was that we were getting into camp always very late at night, so we were hungry, of course, but had we had a little easier schedule, I think we would have been able to consume more food. But we even started to run out of food towards Crane Lake. By the time we got to Crane Lake, we spent one night traveling through the night to catch up on our schedule. We got to Crane Lake, and the very kind folks there were having a Voyageur festival, and they put on a big fish fry for us. And you won't believe the amount of food that our group consumed that day, and it was all very welcome, I must say.
All right, I think Sue had a question.
Not to put you on the spot, Neil, but as the son of Hugh, obviously a visionary, do you have any particular memory of your father in the lead up to this event? Some of his thinking or the drive behind this man?
Well, the 1970 trip was the second of these recreations of voyageur routes that Hugh had organized, and the first one was in 1967. That was for the Centennial celebrations, and the destination was Montreal from Grand Portage. And I just remember I was 7 that year, and I was 10 in 1970, so I didn't get to go, and my 2 older brothers got to go on the canoe trip. But I remember, our house just being, I remember the first time I saw Mark and Wynne Jones. I'd never met them, but I was coming home from a friend's house on Points Avenue in Willowdale, and I turned around behind me. I could see these 2 guys walking the same direction I was going. And I just knew they were going to our house without having any, I'd never spoken to them, nothing. It's just that
because they looked strange.
They looked strange, and people were always coming to our house that I didn't know, and interesting people, and then this summer was particularly busy in terms of arrivals because of all the preparations for this big trip. So I just remember our house was always kind of a Grand Central station of people from everywhere. It was very interesting as a kid. It's fun meeting all these people.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Maybe your brother Ian would comment on the food or some aspects of the trip, because he was there.
Ian, can you say a few words? Are you there?
You'll have to unmute, Ian.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, just in terms of the food, as I recall, as you mentioned, Mark, much of the food was donated, and I think it came from Catelli and Habitat Foods, who I think were out of Montreal. So as I recall, there was some pea soup perhaps, and other items like that. But in terms of the organization leading up to it, as you've recounted, it was pretty much chaos in the house. But as Neil has suggested, that was not necessarily uncommon. I mean, it was it was fun. It was interesting, and so yeah, it wasn't necessarily unusual to have, let's say, boxes of food in the basement, or being sorted and getting ready for a canoe trip of whatever kind. And as Neil mentioned, there was the earlier trip in 1967, and then we also did episodic shorter canoe trips, up to the French River and various other places. So it was kind of all part and parcel of the household.
and Hugh had met on the 67 trip, he met Charlie LeBerge, who was, I
Yeah, he was
forget his
the park-
title, park warden at
Champlain
Samuel de
Park.
Champlain Park on the Mattawa River.
Okay.
And Charlie joined the brigade and went on to Montreal. And I don't think he was on the 70 trip, but he later went to Fort William, to the historic site there.
He wasn't on the trip itself, but he turned up and joined our group in Winnipeg with a 36-foot birch bark canoe, a beautiful, beautiful canoe that I imagine still is around somewhere. Anyhow, he was a master canoe builder and quite a fascinating character.
Yeah, actually, Mark, I think that canoe, it's either at the Canoe Museum in Peterborough, or it might still be up at the former Canoe Museum.
Yeah.
But I think Mike Buss, the biologist, would have the story on that.
Good.
Yeah, Mike wrote the little booklet on Charlie's career and interests. Very, very interesting booklet.
Mark, you talked about plans to fish and to augment it with other interesting items. Did they ever materialize?
No, they didn't. You know, we didn't have time to fish, and once or twice when one of the crew members tried, we didn't get anything. Too bad, because those lakes and rivers are full of fish, and we could have used them, but we really didn't have time. We didn't have much time for anything but to slog through the very long days that we had, and rather challenging conditions. And I must say that summer, that whole area through Quetico was really very, very buggy. We didn't have very good equipment. We had a few tents, but quite often the only thing that got up was Kitbu's teepee. He brought a teepee along, and we cut poles for it and erected that. But of course, it didn't have a ground floor in it, and it was usually full of mosquitoes. So
Would you have traveled faster in smaller canoes?
I think so, but it was not just the fact that these canoes were large, but it was the fact that we were a motley crew, mostly inexperienced, and we had far too much gear. Kitbu brought along 2 steamer trunks full of paraphernalia, breech clouts and fur hats and peace pipes and all sorts of regalia. He had this 26-foot canvas teepee from the prairies, and it got waterlogged, soaked, and weighed a ton. We had this huge bag of mail that we were transporting in a traditional manner from Thunder Bay to Lower Fort Garry, and that got completely soaked. And by the time we got through the first 4 or 5 days, almost took one person to carry that across the portage. It was so heavy. So, had we not had all that gear and had more experience, we could have been as fast or faster than a, say, 17-foot canoe.
Yeah, I should add, Mark, that the canoe that I was in was not part of your party directly, or at least I was in the crew with Glenn Follis and Greg Cowan, who were on the 1967 Cross Canada journey, so they were much more experienced, obviously. And as I recall, there wasn't much excess or superfluous equipment with us. So I think in general, we were probably, I guess, a day or so ahead of your group. And just being one canoe, it was obviously easier to traverse the portages and make good timing in general.
Yeah, well, I remember that quite well because Glenn and Greg picked some of the strongest paddlers, one of the best of the 26-foot canoes, and some reasonably good food, and off you went. And you also took a different route, not exactly the same route we took, and yours turned out to be much quicker. So the film crew, why did the film crew do this? Well, they, I think quite wisely, could see what was going to happen with our group, and they really didn't need us at this stage of the trip to do filming. They had one canoe, 26-foot canoe, and a 17-foot canoe for the filmmakers, and they could stage shots all along the way and not be bothered with this crazy bunch that consisted of the main party. We caught up to them later, obviously, and they were able to do some more filming of all 5 26-foot canoes. But I think they were smart to go ahead and get some good footage, which they did. And they eventually met up with us somewhere just before Lac La Croix. And I remember meeting them coming across one of the portages. And, we hadn't seen them in probably about 8 days. And so it was rather unexpected to run into them. And they had been sent back to pick us up, and they had 2 motors with them. And they kind of took charge and organized us. They built a great big fire very quickly, and they threw in all the oats that we had left, and made a big thick porridge, and dumped in a whole bunch of chocolate that we had, or they had, I can't remember which, and stirred this up. And they had, we at that point found the salt rations. So we all had our first salt rations and consumed this chocolate porridge directly from a pot as we were being towed across Lac La Croix, which went on all night. And so we were under the stars, and it was a beautiful night. But we were very hungry, so we were consuming this concoction, and that mixed with the salt tablets gave everybody indigestion. So it was really quite uncomfortable in the end, but our bellies were full.
Almost as good as the British Navy.
Could well be, yeah.
Mark, did Kirk Whipper have any direct involvement? It sounds like this is sort of the kind of big thinking that he tended to engage in. I'm wondering if he showed up at anywhere along the way.
Good question, Tom. He didn't show up on the trip, but he certainly was involved in the decision to send 2 canoe loads of campers out on this trip. And knowing Kitpu and knowing Hugh MacMillan, he obviously knew there was, it was going to be an eventful trip. So that was really the extent of his involvement, though. I think he was glad to hear that everybody had arrived safely, and in Winnipeg and had enjoyed the ceremonies in Winnipeg. Yeah, and that they hadn't destroyed either of his 2 canoes, 26-foot canoes that he had provided for the trip.
Mark, I'm just wondering, wasn't one of the canoes, the Illinois canoes, wasn't it a 35-footer, a Montreal canoe, or am I mistaken on that?
I don't think it was, but you know,
Because their canoes must have come from Ralph Freeze from the Chicagoland canoe base, I would think.
I think they did, but for whatever reasons, it was by far the heaviest, and they didn't have a very strong group from Illinois, so we ended up having to do much of the portaging of that canoe, which was quite unpleasant at times.
Yes, I can well imagine.
Yeah. Anyhow, if any of you are interested and have others that want to know more, and there's some good links on the WCA website on the digital version of this article, and there's I think a link to the film that was made called again the Voyageurs. I have clips of it here, but the sound quality is not terrific, and it's quite an old print, so and it bears only somewhat resemblance to what actually happened on the trip. Yes, it doesn't follow the real story of the trip. It is the make-believe story of the trip, and so I would invite you to have a look at that at some point. It's kind of actually quite funny in places. It's dated.
Yeah, I can make the link available when I do the video. It's a 3-parter on YouTube, but as Mark says, it's 1970s technology superimposed digitally on YouTube. But you get kind of the idea. That there was an interesting scene where they had the, I think you're on Lake Winnipeg where you swamped the canoe. You tried to go out and it was like, 2-foot waves and got broadside and flipped. And that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if many of the WCA members do reenactments of Voyageur trips or brigades like this. There seems to be an interest in this certainly every Centennial year, and when there are Centennial celebrations in Ontario and in BC had one, and of course the Winnipeg one in 1970. But perhaps there will be some more of these, and they provide a very different experience, and however as interesting and as colorful as this one that took place in 1970.
Yeah, I think the only thing that members do is they do historic rivers, right? You mentioned the Mattawa. I did the Blood Vein a few years ago before COVID. When you go down one of these historic rivers, you go look around and go, nothing has changed. This is the rapid. If there's no dams or anything associated with, Blood Vein or French River or stuff like that. And you go, this is how it was, This is the rapid, this is what the Voyageurs saw, etc. I was actually on the French River when they did a reenactment that they went from Ottawa down the Trans-System to Ontario, Erie, Huron, and they were coming back through the French, and they're going to do the Mattawa, Ottawa. it was this group, I think it was like about a 400 kilometer, maybe it was 1,000. I don't know, it was a long distance. And they were 4 people dressed in traditional garb. I think this was in 2008, because they were reenactment of Etienne Brule, who was the first guy that went across the French River, actually about a year or 2 before Champlain. He brought Champlain across in about 1610. And they were reenacting that. I think it was in 2008, 9, 10, something like that. And that was very interesting. They kind of did that whole circuit dressed in, traditional garb with 15-foot cedar strips canoe with a wanagan clamped in the middle, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but I think most members, pick a river, and there's an historical, aspect of it, like the French you mentioned, Mattawa, Ottawa, those kind of
I
rivers.
did at Candelore, I did a minor reenactment. I was a counselor, and we did a trip from down the French from Restoule Park over to Highway 69 with about, a 26-footer full of 10 or 11-year-olds, 2 or 3 staff. And the one thing I remember is you get that nice long stretch, almost like a lake after you do some of the whitewater, like Blue Chute, which we actually shot, which is probably questionable since we just had one boat. But we had this nice long stretch and this huge tailwind. And because we wanted to simulate the voyageur experience, we had a sail with us that we could step in the boat, and we put it up and sailed away. But I just remember the 11-year-olds all grumbling because they wanted to paddle, getting bored from, whereas the staff were perfectly happy to sit back with the wind filling the sails, because you got a good clip there with the tailwind.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I once ran into a group on the Ottawa River, and they were headed to Huronia, and it was a reenactment. They'd left Quebec City, and then they paddled up the Ottawa. We met them at Voyageur campground at Chute de Blondeau, right where the Ontario and Quebec border would be. And they were all dressed in habitant clothes. They had a priest. They had a large pot, and they were cooking beans every night. What they did is they soaked the beans in a leather pouch all day. And then when they made camp, they would boil the beans and put in some sugar and molasses, pork. And they would leave the big steel pot on the coals overnight. And then in the morning, the beans would be all cooked. That would be baked beans. And that's what they would eat all the next day. And they would sort of re-soak, they would just keep doing this every day. They would re-soak more beans through that day to go into the pot the night. And they put on a little presentation for the campers. And we had a school group in the group campground, and the kids were just enthralled with the presentation that they made, and they had muskets they fired, and put on a little show with the kids and showed them the authentic ways of cooking and how they were eating. But that must have been in the 60s, or 60, maybe even 67, this was a long time ago.
I wouldn't want to have shared a tent with one of them.
I don't know if they had tents. I think they just slept, they just took their canoe and put a tarp over it and crawled under. But I don't know if anyone ever heard of any group arriving. It was a fundraising event for Huronia among the Hurons.
Yeah.
Now, what route would they take to arrive at Huronia? What river?
It's Georgian Bay, right?
Yeah, they would have come out on the French River out on.
Yeah,
onto
so they would
Georgian
come
Bay
down and then Georgian Bay back in to Huronia.
But
Yeah.
they could also have come from Toronto and up through the Holland River,
Okay.
up that way through Lake Simcoe and
Mhm.
across.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up, Mark. Thanks very much for the presentation. Thanks very much for the article. Thanks for the Nastawgan. All aspects. We'll try to connect all the dots. I'll try to put the links in the video so people can refer back to the documents, etc. If you're a member, of course, you can see the Nastawgan online. If you're not a member, it's from about 3 years and then all the way to the beginning, 1974. So we have like 48 years of Nastawgans times 4 on the website. So if you're a member, you have full access to that. And in fact, you get the Nastawgan digitally before the print version comes out, because I think the print just got mailed about a week ago and the digital was sitting there 2-3 weeks ago. So hopefully people have read the article, and now this is a new side of it where you can get some more insight from the actual author. And we've got a few people that have been on the trip with Ian and Mark here. Neil, you're too young. That's what happens when you're youngest. You always miss out on the good stuff. Or maybe you're safe. I don't know.
Gary, I'd just like to make one last comment or observation.
Go ahead, Ian.
I'm not sure, Mark, if you remember this, you may not, but because I didn't realize it until years or decades afterwards. But one of the people that we met in Minnesota was Sig Olson, the author. And at that time, or I think the next year, he became head of the Wilderness Society in the United States.
Mhm.
And I think at one time he was also head of the Sierra Club or whatever it's called.
Yes, well, I had forgotten that, but now that you've mentioned it, it brings back a memory. And
Anyway.
certainly, I'm sure all of you know a bit about Sig Olson's writing. It's just wonderful to go back to his books, many of which he wrote about the Quetico area. They're really, really inspiring, beautiful writing.
Yeah, he actually did. I didn't know this as well until about 2 decades ago. But he also did a trip through what is now Quetico with Robert Marshall, who was the who was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. He and Sig Olson did a trip through there in 1937. And anyway, Sig Olson was a very prominent figure in terms of probably the Wilderness Act and other significant legislation that came into being in the States in the 1970s.
Very good.
So,
Oh, wow.
Thank you, Mark.
Good. Okay, everyone. Have a good
Yeah, thanks,
evening.
Mark.
Yep. Thank you all, and we'll see you again.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Great story.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
it's very good.